August 1831. A spark in Jamaica would set the Caribbean ablaze. 60,000 enslaved people rose as one, torching plantations and shattering chains. The British Empire called it a rebellion. But what if it was something far greater? What if it was the beginning of the end? Before we uncover this buried history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story has been hidden for too long, and we're exposing the truth that changed an empire. Stay until the end, because what you'll learn will shake everything you thought you knew about freedom. The year is 1831, and the British Empire spans the globe. Its wealth flows from plantations across the Caribbean built on the backs of enslaved Africans. The empire tells itself a comfortable lie, that enslaved people accept their condition, that they're content, that rebellion is rare and easily crushed. But in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Demerara, thousands are planning something that will expose that lie forever. This isn't a story about slavery. This is a story about the unbreakable human spirit and the courage it takes to risk everything for freedom. To understand the rebellions, you have to understand the machine they were fighting against. The British Empire had perfected a system of human exploitation across its Caribbean colonies. Jamaica, Barbados, Demerara, Trinidad. These weren't just tropical islands. They were factories of suffering that generated enormous wealth. Sugar plantations stretched for miles, their fields worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, torn from their homelands and sold like livestock. The economics were simple and brutal. Ships left Britain carrying manufactured goods to Africa. There, they traded these goods for human beings. These captives were packed into ship holds and transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that millions died before reaching land. Those who survived were sold in Caribbean markets and put to work producing sugar, cotton, and tobacco. These products were then shipped back to Britain, completing the triangle and generating profits that built banks, funded industries, and created family fortunes that still exist today. Life on the plantations was calculated cruelty. Enslaved people worked from dawn until long after dark, cutting cane under the burning sun. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Sugar cane has sharp edges that slice skin. The mills that processed the cane could catch a hand and pull in an entire arm. Exhaustion was constant. Food was minimal. Clothing was rags. Enslaved people lived in cramped quarters with dirt floors and leaking roofs. Families were torn apart at the whim of owners. Children were sold away from parents. Husbands were separated from wives. Mothers watched their babies grow up belonging to someone else. Punishment was a tool of control. Whipping was routine for the smallest infractions. Working too slowly, speaking back, looking at an overseer the wrong way. The whip could lay open flesh to the bone. Some were locked in stocks for days without water. Others were branded with hot irons. Women faced sexual violence as another layer of terror. The message was clear. You are property, not people. Resist, and the consequences will be unspeakable. But here's what the plantation owners never understood. You cannot strip away someone's humanity, no matter how hard you try. Enslaved Africans maintained their dignity in ways both small and large. They created secret networks of communication, passing information from plantation to plantation through songs, through coded language, through trusted messengers who moved between estates. They preserved African traditions, keeping alive memories of home through music, through stories told to children, through spiritual practices that blended African beliefs with Christianity. They gathered in hidden places to pray, to plan, to remember that they were more than what their enslavers claimed. And they waited. They watched for weakness. They looked for opportunities. Because resistance was never a question of if, but when. The first major crack in the system came in Barbados in 1816. This small island had been enslaving Africans for nearly 2 centuries, its plantation owners growing rich, while their workers lived in misery. But rumors had reached the enslaved population, rumors that the British Parliament was debating abolition, that freedom might already have been granted, but plantation owners were hiding the truth. Whether these rumors were accurate didn't matter. They sparked hope, and hope sparked action. A man named Busa, African-born and working on a plantation in the parish of St. Philip, began organizing. Busa understood timing. He chose Easter weekend, when many white plantation families would be away at church services and social gatherings. The plan spread through the secret networks. On the night of April 14th, fires blazed across the countryside. Cane fields went up in flames, visible for miles. These weren't random acts of destruction. The fires were signals, carefully coordinated to tell enslaved people across Barbados that the moment had come. Thousands rose up. They seized control of plantations. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: cane knives, clubs, stolen muskets. For several days, they held territory and fought back against the militia sent to crush them. But the British response was overwhelming. Martial law was declared. Troops poured onto the island. The rebellion was suppressed with brutal efficiency. Over 1,000 people were killed in battle or executed afterward. Busa himself fell fighting. The British made examples of the leaders, displaying their bodies as warnings. But the warning had the opposite effect. Word of Barbados spread across the Caribbean. Enslaved people everywhere now knew that large-scale resistance was possible. They'd seen it done. 7 years later, in the colony of Demerara on the coast of South America, another uprising would prove that Barbados was no isolated incident. Demerara, in 1823, was a colony of vast plantations producing sugar for the British market. The enslaved population numbered over 70,000, vastly outnumbering the white colonists. A man named Kwamina, who worked as a carpenter and served as a deacon in a Christian chapel, began organizing with his son, Jack Gladstone. They'd heard that reform movements in Britain were pushing for better treatment of enslaved people. They believed, wrongly, that improvements had already been approved, but local plantation owners were refusing to implement them. Kwamina and Jack planned something remarkable. They didn't want violence. They wanted dignity. The plan was for a work stoppage. 10,000 people across multiple plantations would simply refuse to work until their rights were recognized. It was an early form of a general strike, an attempt to prove their humanity and demand justice without bloodshed. On August 18th, the uprising began. Thousands of enslaved people on the east coast of Demerara took control of their plantations. They detained plantation managers but didn't harm them. They made clear demands. They wanted their freedom, or at least recognition of reforms they believed had been granted. For several days, they controlled a significant portion of the colony. But the British governor declared martial law and sent in troops. What had begun as a non-violent protest became a massacre. Over 200 people were killed in fighting. Hundreds more were arrested. The trials that followed were a mockery of justice. Kwamina was shot while trying to escape, and his body was displayed in chains as a warning. Jack Gladstone was sentenced to death, though later deported. Over 40 others were hanged. But perhaps most shocking, the British authorities arrested and prosecuted John Smith, a white missionary who had preached to enslaved people. They blamed him for encouraging the uprising through his Christian teachings about equality before God. Smith died in prison before his sentence could be carried out, becoming a martyr for the abolitionist cause back in Britain. Demerara proved that enslaved people weren't violent by nature. They'd tried peaceful resistance and been met with bullets. The message was clear. The empire would give them nothing willingly. Which brings us to Jamaica, 1831, and the rebellion that would finally break the system. Samuel Sharpe was not what plantation owners expected in a rebel leader. He was literate, eloquent, and deeply religious. He served as a deacon in a Baptist church in Montego Bay, and his position gave him access to both enslaved people across multiple plantations and information from the outside world. Sharpe read newspapers. He knew about the abolitionist debates raging in British Parliament. He understood that slavery's days might be numbered, but he also knew that plantation owners would resist change with everything they had. Sharpe began speaking to people quietly, carefully. He traveled between plantations under the cover of religious gatherings. Baptist churches had become centers of community for enslaved people, places where they could gather without immediate suspicion. Sharpe used these networks brilliantly. His message was clear. They would strike during Christmas week of 1831. They wouldn't murder or burn at first. They would simply refuse to work. No labor, no profit. The plantation owners would be forced to negotiate. Sharpe's plan spread like wildfire through western Jamaica. The Christmas season was chosen strategically. It was traditionally a time when enslaved people received a few days of rest, so gatherings wouldn't seem suspicious. As Christmas approached, plantation owners noticed nothing unusual. They had no idea that 60,000 people were preparing to change history. On December 27, 1831, enslaved people across Jamaica's western parishes simply didn't show up for work. Overseers found empty fields. When they went to the quarters demanding explanations, they were told calmly, "We will not work until we are paid fair wages and treated as human beings." Some plantation managers tried threats. They tried whippings. But you cannot whip 60,000 people. You cannot terrorize a population that has decided they've had enough. The colonial government panicked. The governor declared martial law. Militia forces were mobilized. And then the plantations began to burn. When it became clear that negotiation wasn't coming, that the British response would be violence, the work stoppage transformed into open rebellion. Cane fields blazed across the countryside. Great houses were torched. Enslaved people armed themselves and fought back against the militia and British troops sent to crush them. For weeks, large portions of western Jamaica were under rebel control. People who had been treated as property were suddenly making decisions, defending territory, operating as organized military units. The British military struggled to regain control. This wasn't a small uprising. This was a revolution. Property damage exceeded £1 million, an astronomical sum that represented more than just buildings and crops. It represented the economic foundation of Jamaica's plantation system going up in smoke. But the British Empire had resources that the rebels didn't. More troops arrived from other colonies. Artillery was brought to bear. Slowly, brutally, the rebellion was suppressed. Over 500 people were killed in combat or captured and executed afterward. Samuel Sharpe was among those caught. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. On May 23, 1832, Samuel Sharpe was led to the gallows in Montego Bay. His final words before death became legendary. "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." He died believing his rebellion had failed. He had no idea what he'd actually accomplished. News of Jamaica reached Britain. and caused an uproar. The scope of the rebellion shocked Parliament and the public. 60,000 people rising up wasn't a disturbance. It was a clear message that the entire system was unsustainable. Abolitionists in Britain, who had been pushing for years to end slavery, suddenly had undeniable proof of their arguments. Enslaved people were not content. They would fight, and they would keep fighting until slavery ended or everyone died trying. But the real change came from an unexpected place: economics. The Baptist War had destroyed huge amounts of property. Insurance costs for Caribbean plantations skyrocketed. Plantation owners couldn't get affordable coverage for their holdings. British banks became reluctant to provide loans to Caribbean estates that might burn down at any moment. The constant threat of rebellion meant colonists had to maintain large military forces, which was expensive. Plantation owners lived in fear, many moving back to Britain and leaving their estates to hired managers. The sugar economy that had generated such wealth was becoming more trouble than it was worth. Add to this the fact that other countries were producing sugar without slavery, creating competition. The moral arguments against slavery were now backed by cold financial calculations. Britain was spending enormous sums maintaining control over restive colonies while facing international embarrassment and domestic opposition. Something had to give. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. On August 1, 1834, slavery was officially abolished throughout most of the British Empire. But this wasn't the freedom that Samuel Sharpe and thousands of others had died for. The Abolition Act included a cruel catch: the apprenticeship system. Formerly enslaved people were now apprentices who had to continue working for their former owners, unpaid, for 4 to 6 more years. It was slavery with a different name. Even this halfway measure wouldn't have happened without the rebellions. The Baptist War and the uprisings before it had made slavery economically unworkable and politically impossible. The empire didn't end slavery out of moral enlightenment. It ended slavery because enslaved people made it impossible to continue. Complete emancipation finally came in 1838, when the apprenticeship system was abolished. After centuries of enslavement, people were legally free. But freedom came without justice. The British government paid £20 million in compensation to the slave owners, not the enslaved. Former enslavers received payment for their lost property. People who had been enslaved received nothing: no land, no compensation for generations of stolen labor, no reparations for the violence and trauma and stolen lives. Meanwhile, the British taxpayers paid off that £20 million debt through their taxes until 2015. That's not a typo. Until 2015, British citizens were still paying the financial legacy of compensating slave owners for the end of slavery. So what did these rebellions achieve? They proved that enslaved people were never passive victims waiting for others to free them. They were active agents of their own liberation, who fought with courage and strategic brilliance despite overwhelming odds. Every rebellion, even those that were militarily defeated, made slavery more costly and more difficult to maintain. Each uprising inspired others. The knowledge that resistance was possible spread across the Atlantic world. These rebellions accelerated the end of slavery by decades. Without them, the economic and political forces maintaining slavery would have continued far longer. British abolitionists were important, but they weren't sufficient. It took people willing to die for freedom to finally break the system. Most of the names of those who fought have been lost. Colonial records were designed to erase them, to minimize their resistance, to pretend that slavery ended through the goodness of British hearts rather than the courage of African rebels. Historians have had to piece together what actually happened from fragments, from oral traditions passed down through generations, from the spaces between official lies. But we know this: they fought, they organized, they refused to accept that any human being could own another. And their refusal changed the world. Today, many Caribbean nations celebrate Emancipation Day on August 1st. There are monuments to Samuel Sharpe and Busa and others who led rebellions. But in many places, their stories are still not fully taught. School curriculums in Britain and elsewhere often gloss over the role of enslaved people in ending their own bondage, preferring narratives about enlightened white abolitionists generously granting freedom. The truth is more complicated and more inspiring. Freedom was never given. It was seized. It was fought for. It was died for. The rebels of Barbados, Demerara, and Jamaica didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for children who weren't born yet. They fought for a future they knew they'd never see. And they won. These rebels didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for a future they'd never see. Their courage ended an empire's cruelest institution. Samuel Sharpe went to the gallows, believing he'd failed. But within 2 years of his death, slavery was legally abolished. Within 6 years, complete freedom came. He didn't fail. He won. This pattern repeated itself across the Americas. Wherever slavery existed, resistance existed. From the Haitian Revolution that created the first Black Republic, to the Maroon communities in Jamaica and Suriname who fought colonial powers to a standstill, to countless smaller acts of defiance that chipped away at the system, freedom was never granted from above. It was demanded from below. Honor their memory by subscribing to this channel and sharing this video. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Drop a comment telling us what surprised you most. And check out our next video where we explore the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt that created a nation. These stories deserve to be told. These heroes deserve to be remembered. See you in the next one. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Samuel Sharpe and 60,000 others tried peace first. They asked for dignity. They were answered with violence. So they gave the British Empire exactly what it deserved: a rebellion that shook the foundations of slavery and hastened its end. They won. Never forget that. They won.